Hello, back here for another 10-minute takeover with Steve, James and Steve. With this time we're going to cover 6 ways to kill an EMI scheme. So lots of people watching this video will be running EMI schemes. What you probably won't have seen is where EMI schemes go wrong, and they often go wrong too late to be recovered at the point of a transaction event where it can be very expensive for the people that hold these EMI options. So the guys are going to cover some of these issues that we see. James Peck is a corporate tax partner and team working with fast growth companies, many of who have EMI schemes, and James is involved in working with those guys. And Steve Round is a transaction tax specialist. He works for investors looking at companies where there may be issues around EMI schemes. He's also working for companies as they go into a transaction and making sure they're ready to deal with diligence on things around things like EMI and other issues in the business. So James, I'll hand over to you, and we're going to run through this as fast as we can and keep it tight, but lots to talk about.
Yeah, as always, there's loads to cover. So the aim of this session is to cover off what we see during exit and fundraise readiness in terms of EMI schemes, where they go wrong, and the lessons that we've learned from others' mistakes. So hopefully what we're going to do is deep dive into some of the key areas. So we've picked out 6 key areas that we think that things go wrong, and then we're going to do a deeper dive into those in a bit more detail. So Steve, one of the things that always comes up when we're talking to scaling tech businesses is this concept of promised shares. So where one individual basically hasn't issued share options, but actually there is an intention to issue them, but they haven't in the future. What do you see the issue there, and what's the main issues there, and how do we rectify those?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you often hear of founders promising share options or shares. And I think that the reality is that it's the position at the time of grant of an option or award of shares which is the relevant point from a tax perspective. So if you're promised, that really is a moot point, and the tax position is going to be driven by when you actually come to issue the shares or grant the options. That is likely to be at a later date. It's likely to be at a higher valuation. So ultimately that's passing less value into the hands of the participants than you might have otherwise had if you'd have dealt with those options at the time of the promise.
Yeah, agreed. So with that one, it's quite often the point that it's about setting expectations, isn't it? Because you've promised something to someone at an earlier stage, then subsequently the value of the business has incrementally increased. Alternatively, there's been a fundraise event which has changed the value of the business. So it's about kind of communicating that point back to the individual and saying, actually, whilst I was going to grant you the share options, there's now the business has moved on, and we see that happen more often than not. And it is always a challenge around the fundraise event, because that really has a knock-on impact in terms of the business as a whole, doesn't it?
It does. I think the key message is to grant the option as soon as possible in this thought process. The longer you leave it, the more expensive it's going to get. Let's move on to that valuation point, because valuation comes up a lot when we're talking about EMI, and where they're getting, the first point really is that, is there a requirement to actually get a valuation when you're agreeing EMI options?
There isn't a requirement to get a valuation agreed, but from a tax due diligence perspective, in my experience acting for many sellers, this is a point which is challenged on pretty much every due diligence exercise. So without that piece of paper, you're really risking an element of the proceeds on the sale being eroded through pay-as-you-earn or national insurance charges.
Okay, let me just pick up on that point a little bit more then, because when we write to HMRC to agree a valuation for share options, we're agreeing what the market value is, the market value that would be that we can agree for the share options. That then stands as almost like a marker, doesn't it? What are the differences in terms of any variations to what's agreed with HMRC, and therefore what's the issue if you don't agree that valuation specifically with HMRC?
Yeah, so I think, as you've said, a fundraise, it has a price. Whether that's a strategic premium as an investor might be willing to pay to get invested in this business, that doesn't necessarily detract from the fact that when you write to the revenue to agree a valuation for EMI, you need to be disclosing all material facts. If you don't disclose all material facts, I think that there's a real risk that valuation approval from the revenue could be void, which brings you back to this risk on a future sale that a buyer simply takes the stance that you haven't agreed the number with sufficient disclosure. So there is a risk that you've granted the options at less than value.
Yeah.
I would expect a fundraise value to be disclosed to the revenue, and it is possible to deviate from that number in our experience, but there typically needs to be a passing of time rather than it being concurrent with the fundraise, and there needs to have been something commercially happened that means that value isn't necessarily the right starting point.
No, agreed. There's always that tension when you're doing a fundraise, too close to the fundraise, and you're almost using that as a starting point for the purpose of the valuation, which obviously, given it's a fundraise, has kind of future hope attached to it. It's far easier to, in theory, use a valuation based on historical trading performance, and therefore moving away and pegging to that fundraise event. We quite often see a distinction when we talk about kind of prefs and ordinary shares. What impact does that have in terms of evaluation?
Yes, I mean, fundamentally, the EMI options would be over ordinary shares. So if a fundraiser's included prefs, then depending on how the cash subscription has been handled by the company, those preference shares may well depress the value of the ordinary shares. Now, as such, it may be possible to seek a lower value post-fundraise.
Yeah, good point. And the other point is where, and I know this comes up quite a lot when you're doing your diligence, that when you're looking at valuations, the time limits are important. And when HMRC will give you a time limit. Why is that so important?
Yeah, we often see this actually in diligence. So the revenue's valuation approval will usually be valid for 90 days. Now, sometimes it can take a bit longer than that to get the documentation agreed and the terms, and it goes through shortly after. And yes, I mean, even if it goes through on day 91 or 92, we see DD providers saying that valuation approval is invalid. But probably the more common thing we see is that a valuation was done, and then 6 to 12 months later, the company relies on that same valuation. Whereas in actual fact, there's been an increase in performance during that year, and on that basis, it may well be light.
Yeah, agreed. So the importance is always to kind of renew those valuations with HMRC based on the performance of the business, based on if there have been fundraise events, and making sure that that's fully disclosed to HMRC so that actually they have a full understanding of what's happening.
Yeah, and I think if you're going to breach the 90 days by even 1 day, it's worth sending the letter in just to get them to agree it again.
We touched on previously this impact of granting options below market value. So therefore, we're touching on that valuation point again. You know, if we grant options below market value, what is the impact of that?
Yeah, I think there's two angles here. So many clients choose to grant below market value because it makes the exercise more affordable to the share option holder. Often nominal value, in fact, so they can buy their shares for a few pounds. But if you're granting below market value, then on exercise, the difference in the discount effectively at grant is brought into charge, and that charge is going to be income tax, possibly with national insurance as well, depending on the other circumstances. Now, what can happen here is that clients think that they've granted at market value, but either the valuation had timed out, or certain facts weren't disclosed in the valuation letter to HMRC, or no valuation was obtained at all. And in those three scenarios, you're opening yourself up to a potential charge on exercise through the due diligence process. Now, it does go further than that. If you've granted below market value, that can extrapolate into a charge on the future sale itself, and that charge can be based on a proportion of the consideration. And I must say, we've seen that charge arise in DD on almost half of our transactions this year. Now, it is possible to make an election on exercise that should mitigate that charge on future sale, but that election has to be made within 14 days of exercise. So there's a real need there to keep on top of the options when they're exercised, and whether we're comfortable that we've got full valuation approval.
Understood. It's a really, really helpful tip, that, because as you said, it's often a commercial driver to grant options below the market value, in order to kind of provide almost an inherent kind of motivation to staff, which fundamentally is the reason that, you know, companies are providing EMI options. Just moving on to another point, which is we have quite a lot of questions about performance conditions and their impact. What's the main concern that companies need to be concerned with here when they're looking at kind of performance conditions?
Sure. So I think in my experience, I find options are often drafted up front to be just a little bit too tight. What I mean by that is they're very rigid in their performance conditions, which would enable an exercise to arise. So they have to be fully satisfied in order to exercise their option and get their shares. In practice, it can often materialise that issues outside of the company's control or the participants' control, such as a recession or indeed COVID, can mean that performance conditions haven't been met. Nevertheless, the board wants to enable those individuals to exercise their options. And that's a really difficult position to be in, because varying the options to enable an exercise when they wouldn't otherwise have been entitled to exercise is often considered a fundamental change to the option terms. And in HMRC's view and in tax DD view, that will likely be a deemed lapse and regrant of the option at the point that variation is made. So if that's shortly before or at the time of a sale event, that is likely to remove all of the tax benefits from the participant's perspective of the EMI scheme.
We quite often talk about disqualifying events. Now, a disqualifying event basically means that when an individual considers they're going to have EMI options and therefore the tax benefits attached to that, if there is such thing as a disqualifying event, the impact of that means that those benefits that would have derived through an EMI fall away, and therefore they are subject to kind of income tax on the subsequent exercise. Can we just touch on a couple of things that you see as the kind of key disqualifying events for businesses, so that they have an idea of when they might breach those, or what are the key areas?
Sure. I mean, as you say, the disqualifying event removes the tax benefits afforded to EMI. Now, it's important to say first that if you do have a disqualifying event, you do have 90 days to exercise without losing the EMI status, subject to being able to exercise under the scheme rules. And also, following the disqualifying event, it's only the increase in value from that point that is subject to income tax. So there are still some benefits that would be retained. But some typical ones we see, so one of the requirements of EMI is a working time requirement for the participant, which broadly 25 hours per week needs to be spent on the business of the EMI company or its subsidiaries, or if they do less time than that, 75% of their time. Now, people who are working towards retirement but want to maintain an interest in an exit event may well drop below that requirement, which would be a disqualifying event on that individual. But I think more importantly, in the sort of tech or high growth space, it can be a real challenge for founders who might have been diluted down to quite a small interest because of VCs or private equity, and they've effectively got EMI as a top-up vehicle, but in a structure where they have another business outside of this one.
Yeah.
So they're effectively splitting their time across multiple businesses. You need to be really careful in that circumstance, because if they're spending a lot of their time on the non-EMI business, that may well be a disqualifying event because of not meeting that working time requirement.
Yeah. Very good point. Outside of the working time requirement, what else do we see in terms of some of the key kind of disqualifying events? I know we've spoken recently in terms of the independence rules.
Yeah, so there's a couple of other ones to bring out. So one is that you fundamentally don't qualify for EMI and cease to qualify if the company becomes under the control of another company. Now, that's assuming no replacement option is granted in the company that has acquired. But where this can get difficult is in the event that venture capital or private equity are taking a controlling interest and their structure includes a company, which is actually quite common. That can end up effectively being a disqualifying event and ceasing all EMI benefits going forward. So it's really important that that's considered at the time that investor comes in. And then a final one that we do often see, and this is often the one that is an accident in my view, is when the option scheme or the underlying shares have their terms varied, and such variation results in a shift of value either from EMI or to the share or to the underlying shares. A value being passed into the participants' options or into the underlying shares is a disqualifying event.
Yeah, understood. It'd be remiss of us not to also mention the fact that whilst they're not disqualifying events, such thing as breaching employee or gross asset limits as well have an impact on the qualification under EMI. Is that right?
Yes. So there are various conditions to meet, but broadly, if one of those being 30 million of gross assets in the underlying company or group, and no more than 250 full-time equivalent employees. Now, if they're breached subsequent to grant, that's okay, that's not a disqualifying event, but it would mean that you can no longer grant further options under the EMI scheme.
One of the things that we see, just moving on to another topic, one of the things that we see more often than not when we're looking at diligence is quite a basic point, but around non-compliance. More often than not, we see, you touched on the point that HMRC's valuations are valid for 90 days. Are there any other time limits that we need to be aware of, which can have a dramatic effect in terms of the qualification for EMI?
Yes, so it's essential that the grants are notified to HMRC within 92 days of the grant, and since April 2014, that's been through the online employment-related securities portal, accessed through the company's pay-as-you-earn login typically. That is a statutory requirement. So if that notification hasn't gone in, then theoretically there's not an EMI scheme. Now, HMRC have got the power to be lenient if you've got a reasonable excuse as to why it's late, but fundamentally it's important that that's in time.
Okay. Yeah. We see a lot of companies falling outside of that because they haven't made the required notifications, which is a challenge.
Another area which I think it's important, and we have seen a few times, is this working time declaration that I've just mentioned earlier. So that working time declaration needs to be signed by the participant at the time of the grant. Now, pre-April 2014, that used to just be a tick box on the EMI 1 form, which was the paper form used to report the grant. But since then, the declarations need to be built into the legal documents. So you often see it within the option agreement itself. Now, without that being present, there is fundamentally that requirement's missed. The working time declaration hasn't been given. We've seen this on a couple of DDs just in the last 12 months, where fundamentally that scheme doesn't qualify.
Okay.
Now there is a relaxation on that point we were discussing earlier, James, that if you haven't met the working time declaration because of COVID, either subsequent to the option being granted or at the time of the grant, HMRC have relaxed that requirement and you're generally okay.
Yeah, that was a concern last year, wasn't it? Where there was uncertainty, and I think it was more than 90 days had passed before HMRC confirmed their view, but they did confirm that there wasn't going to be a disqualifying event by virtue of furlough. We probably need to wrap up at that point, given the fact that we're only supposed to have a 10-15 minute session. We've covered a lot of areas today, delving into where it goes wrong with EMIs, how to kill an EMI in many different ways. I think what this has also led on to is we should do a session as well where we look at beyond EMI. So if you do, breach the limits, or if you have a disqualifying event, if you are being, taken over and the independence rules are breached, what do you look at beyond EMI? What are the options available to you? We'll do another session on that in due course and cover off some of the areas around kind of CSOPs and growth share schemes and unapproved, and give a little bit of background in terms of how those might work more commercially.
Cool, thank you guys. And just to say to those watching, EMI schemes are great, but if you're the finance person in a business when the EMI scheme is, when you get to a transaction event, the EMI scheme doesn't work as it's meant to work, then it's a painful place to be. Just look, reach out to us if you need anyone to bounce anything off, or you want to discuss any potential issues, or even just an overview of the scheme as you have it, and make sure you've kind of got what you need done, and that is done. So we're happy to have those conversations. So thanks for watching, thanks guys for doing the session, and look forward to the next one with plenty more of these sessions coming. Thanks for watching. Cheers guys.